ערב טוב וחג שמח לכולנו. אני מאוד שמחה ומתרגשת לפתוח את המפגש הזה, שמגיע אחרי יום גדוש בפעילות שבילינו ביחד במודיעין. שמחנו מאוד מאוד שהגיעו הרבה מיילדות והשתתפו, ושכולנו זכינו גם להיפגש פנים אל פנים וגם ליהנות ולבלות. אני רוצה ככה על הדרך, לפני שנתחיל את המפגש הזה, ולפני שאני אציג את האורחת העיקרית שלנו, להגיד עוד פעם תודה לכל מי שלקחה חלק ביום הזה. אז היו ככה כמה מיילדות שתרמו במיוחד ליום הזה. אני רוצה להודות לעדה בונה, הגזברית שלנו, לוורד דלל, שהיא מיילדת מהקהילה והיא מאוד מאוד פעילה, לטניה לוי, האחות האחראית בהלל יפה, ללאה מלמד, שהיא מיילדת מאוד פעילה מסורוקה, למיכל וולף, שהיא מיילדת מאוד פעילה מבלינסון, לאוסנת מסורוקה, שגם הצטרפה אלינו, לסמירה מהעמק שהצטרפה ועזרה לנו, ליואנה משערי צדק, לאירי סמיר מאסף הרופא, לדינה ויינשטיין, שעכשיו תכירו אותה, תפגשו אותה ותזכו ליהנות מחדות לשונה ושכלה, למינדי לוי שעזרה לנו לתפור ולרקום ולטוות את המפגש הזה הנוכחי, לשירי נגר שעזרה לנו גם לארגן את היום בפארק וגם אותה תשמעו הערב, לליטל קרן מליסט שהתגייסה לעזור לנו עם הסוואטשרטים, וכמובן תודה גדולה לארי בלוך שעומד מאחורי המפגש הזה ועזר לנו להתארגן וגם לעשות חזרות וגם ככה להגיע יותר מהוקצעות למפגש שכזה. אז הערב נארח את בטי אן דייויס, שהיא מיילדת קנדית באמת רבת פעלים. שלחתי ככה משהו קצר לגביה, אבל זה באמת אפס קצהו של ה-CV שלה ושל הדברים שהיא עושה. היא מעוררת השראה בהרבה אופנים, ואנחנו נשמח ככה ללמוד ממנה ולשמוע ממנה. תשוחח איתה, כמו שאמרתי, דינה ויינשטיין, האחות האחראית בחדר לידה ביקור חולים, שזה שלוחה של שערי צדק. וזהו, תכף ומיד הבמה תהיה של דינה. לפני זה אני מתכבדת להזמין את איריס רז, יושבת ראש ארגון המיילדות, שתפתח את סדרת הברכות. מאחלת לכם בהנאה.
ערב טוב לכולנו וחג מיילדות שמח. בדיוק היום לפני שנה היינו בעיצומו של השינוי הגדול שפרץ לחיינו בעקבות מגפת הקורונה. נכנסנו לסגר ויצאנו מסגר, נכנסנו לסגר ויצאנו ונכנסנו. עטינו מסכות ואנחנו עדיין נוטים באופן חלקי. התמגנו והתפשטנו. למדנו לעבוד במציאות חדשה, קשה, מאתגרת. בה החיוך שלנו נראה רק דרך הבעת העיניים. אבל לאט לאט אנחנו חוזרות לעצמנו, למוכר ולידוע. קרו לנו המון דברים אישיים ומשפחתיים בשנה האחרונה, אך יש דבר אחד שנכנסנו אליו והוא נכנס לחיינו. גילינו את יתרונותיו הגדולים וטרם יצאנו ממנו, וכנראה שלא באמת נצא ממנו, אלא נאמץ אותו אל חיינו כדרך חיים, והוא ידידנו הזום כמובן. נכון, בזכותו הקשר בינינו הפך בשנה האחרונה לכל כך משמעותי. היכולת שלנו לפתח ולקדם את הארגון קיבלה תאוצה ותנופה רבה שהביאה אותנו לעשייה שלא ידענו כמותה. אז מה היה לנו בשנת 2020, שנת המיילדת והאחות העולמית? פתחנו ביום המיילדת ובו הקדשנו 3 שעות לברכה ושיר בגלגלץ לכל המיילדות. חילקנו שי לכל מיילדת, קיימנו פגישה עם מיילדות ישראליות העובדות ברחבי העולם לשיחה והיכרות, וסיימנו בשיחה על פיתוח מקצועי אישי. המשכנו בהקמת בית ספר ללימודי המשך, ויצאנו לדרך עם קורסים מיוחדים, קורס מיניות, 2 קורסים ללידה טבעית, טראומה במרחב חדר לידה, מיינדפולנס, ומחר, אחרי הצהריים, ייפתח הקורס העוסק ברצפת האגן, ויש עוד קורסים המתוכננים שבדרך. זכינו להרצאות חודשיות, מקצועיות, מלמדות, המוסיפות נדבך לידע שלנו. קיימנו יום עיון בו הוצגו פרויקטים הנעשים בחדרי הלידה השונים. בחרנו לוגו חדש ובעקבותיו הסלוגן הכל כך מדויק, אני איתך. הקמנו אתר מדיה חדש מעודכן עם כל השכלולים החדשים שקיימים, הכולל בתוכו אתר הרשמה לכל פעילות שמתקיימת, כולל הרשמה לחברות בארגון ותשלום. לא נשכח את כוחה של הרשת החברתית. נפתחה קבוצת פייסבוק בפתיחות מלאה, ובה חברות כ-900 מיילדות. זכינו לקיים הדלקת נרות חנוכה משותפת, יחד, כל חדרי הלידה, והפצנו אור. כל חדר לידה אימץ מקלט לנשים מוכות שחוו אלימות, או מקלט של נערות במצוקה ודאג לחסרונן. לקחנו חלק בבג"ץ מרכזי לידה על ידי כתיבת נייר עמדה תומך בסוגיה, שצורף למסמכי העתירה, וגם עלינו להפגין בירושלים יחד עם העותרות, היולדות ונשים תומכות. הגדלנו את מספר המיילדות החברות בארגון מ-890 ל-1,300. החלפנו משרד עורכי דין, בחרנו ברואה חשבון חדש, חילקנו שי לכל מיילדת באשר היא חברה או שאינה חברה בארגון, ביום המיילדת לפני שנה ובראש השנה. והיום, ביום הזה ממש, כל חדר לידה קיבל שי המיועד למיילדות שנשארו לעבוד, כביטוי להערכה ותודה, ובנוסף, כל מיילדת החברה בארגון קיבלה סוואטשרט במתנה. אין ספק, הייתה לנו שנה עמוסה ומלאה, אבל אנחנו לא התעייפנו, לא לדאוג, פנינו קדימה, להמשך פיתוח ומיצוב מקומה ועשייתה של המיילדת בישראל. הערב נפגוש את המיילדת בטי אן דייויס ונשמע הרצאה מרתקת מפיה. נשיק 2 סרטוני תדמית ונזכה להיחשף לקהילת המדיה החדשה שהוקמה, מילה של מיילדת. אז באמת אחרי שנה של עשייה כזאת ענפה, אני רוצה להגיד תודה לכל המיילדות הלוקחות חלק בעשייה ללא לאות, בהתנדבות ומייצרות רק טוב. שיהיה לכולנו ערב מעניין ומרתק. חג מיילדות שמח. אני מזמינה את שירי נגר, מיילדת והשנה גם יולדת, סגנית אחות אחראית בבית חולים לניאדו, לברך.
תודה איריס, ובאמת ראשית תודה לאיריס, לגומר, לוורד, לכל הרשימה הארוכה של המיילדות שעמלו וטרחו והשקיעו על היום המקסים שהיה ובטוח על הערב המקסים שיהיה. אז בהיותי מיילדת ומזה חודש גם יולדת, זכיתי לראות ולחוות, והפעם משתי הקצוות, ולענות לעצמי על השאלה, מדוע יולדות הן קהל שלנצח אסיר תודה? אז התשובה לכך ארוכה, ולי מוקצבות רק כמה דקות, והיא גם בטח משתנה ובעלת פריזמות רבות. אך בי מה שנגע הוא שילוב הידיים, התבונה העמוקה בידי הזהב, ההכוונה המדויקת, המחויבות לטובה, והראייה מה מקצועית הכי נכון עבורי, הרבה יותר מכל MD. כי האפשרות הייחודית שניתנה לנו המיילדות היא פלאית, לקחת חלק במעשה בראשית, לגעת בבריאה וללוות נשים במסע הגדול מכל, מסע היסטורי, חברתי, אנושי ואישי, הנוגע בנשמה, אך רואה את המכלול. אז בשמי, בשם חדר לידה לניאדו, בשם היולדות בבתי החולים או בבית, ובשם קהילת המיילדות הגלובלית, מאחלת לכולנו שרק נמשיך לעשות טוב ולהיות גאות במקצוע שלנו. תודה. שמחה להזמין את נא ויינסטיין, מיילדת אחראית חדר לידה, שלוחת ביקור חולים, למרכז הרפואי שערי צדק.
ערב טוב, תודה שירי. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce the world-famous midwife and social activist Betty Ann Davis. Some of you may have heard of her. She is famous for her article in the British Medical Journal on home birth that was published in 2005. It was the largest prospective home birth article published in a medical journal. She even visited Israel. She was invited by Dr. Mark Laserman to speak about breech births in Beilinson Hospital and ended up talking about home births. She has also put out 3 edited volumes on birth models, all with Robbie Davis Floyd and other authors. Her latest book just came out. It's called Birthing Models on the Human Rights Frontier, Speaking Truth to Power. There's even a chapter about a coexistence group of Israeli and Palestinian midwives. Betty Ann, welcome to Virtual Israel. Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us how you became a midwife?
Well, before we do that, I just have to tell you, every Canadian, whenever they speak, begin by saying, we welcome you and acknowledge that we are working right now and sharing the ancestral traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Indigenous group of Canada. They originally were here and we are only settlers on this land. And even Parliament Hill, which is in Ottawa, is on unceded territory, meaning it was never actually granted from the natives. They did not actually, were not actually given this to us in their treaty, but they let us use it, which is really important for us to say.
So thank you to them as well.
Yeah, and I have to say I've been distracted, but there's a beaver down here, and if he comes back, I'll have to get up and show him to you. It's actually pretty funny. We can live in Ottawa, outside of Ottawa, quite close, and we can actually be 40 minutes, 50 minutes from town. I'm on call, but I still live out in the country.
That's so cool.
So you wanted to know how I became a midwife?
Yes, let's start at the very beginning.
At the very beginning, okay. I became a midwife when I was in Guatemala, traveling, basically hitchhiking in the 1970s, and I came across a very interesting group that had a natural healing school. And what happened was, as I was living there, we had an earthquake. And when the earthquake happened, and this was 1976, and even a little bit before, I was starting to do births for local people. But when the earthquake hit, it was terrible, and everybody's house was falling down. And we were cut off by avalanches. And I ended up learning from the traditional midwives. And I was there for 4 years.
Wow. And you understood you had a baby over there in the middle of all this?
Yeah, and I had my first baby on the border of Belize and Guatemala in the middle of turbulence, because there were, at that time, Belize was considered British Honduras, and the British thought they owned it, and Guatemala thought they owned it. So my little baby was born in the middle of nowhere in a coconut hut.
And so there you were apprenticing by the midwives?
By that time, I was doing midwifery there, as well as with the midwives in Guatemala. I was actually starting to learn from one of the British midwives who was planted in Belize, because it was a British colony.
Wow. And where did you go from there? So
from there, and I think I might just share my screen at this point, because I hope I have the right one up, actually. No. Yeah, here we go. I'm just going to share my slides, because I think it's a pretty important thing right now to go to it. Here it comes. So what happened from there was I decided that well, first of all, I also wanted to, this is the Anishinaabe. And this is also something I heard in Hebrew. I think I understood it. This is a little bit of why I'm in Israel, is because of the connection I have with having met Mindy Levy here at this conference. where I had just come back from Afghanistan, and I also have the connection with Israel because Mark Glazerman, who's right here pictured, had me come over to talk at the Bellinson Hospital about breach. And here is this article that I heard somebody mention, or maybe you did it in English because I heard it. That's what that's about. And here are these books that I've been working on with Robbie that I think I heard you say as well. And this is one of the most important ones for me right now, this one on the human rights frontier.
Your latest book.
The latest book. This is actually the latest book, but this is the one that's really kicking ass, if we say in English. It's the one that's, I think, a really important one. And
so
here are the
journey, how you made it to Canada.
So I made it to Canada because, well, actually, I left Guatemala and went to Alabama. I lived in Alabama for 3 years. I worked with Black granny midwives as well. And the reason for that is because I was working at a Seventh-day Adventist back to the land naturopathy clinic, and we were working with the Black population, and this was just about 10 years after the civil rights movement. So it was quite a decimated group. It was quite a group that was very much affected by the civil rights movement.
But I, for how many years?
I was there for 3. So I was outside of Canada for 8 years, learning about midwifery and learning about natural healing and learning about social movements, really, learning about how to change things.
Right. And when you got to Canada, what did you find in terms of midwifery?
I found something quite different from, I didn't realize that we didn't have any midwifery. I didn't realize that it just wasn't in existence. And I thought about, and when I was preparing the slideshow, I thought about the fact that Israel has had midwifery, I'm sure, for centuries. I have no idea, but that's what I know. I know that from the Bible. And I looked at Israel, and I just wanted to show you, see this little tiny thing here? This is Israel right here, where that arrow is. And I wanted to show this because I didn't realize how much bigger our country is. Like, look, this is Israel, this little tiny speck. But I also wanted to say that I think we have a lot in common, because I looked up the Human Capital Index from the World Bank, and that what that is it basically, it looks at the potential for children or babies born today, depending on their the health and economic growth and education of the population, where they will be. And you can't see this. We can see it right here, but this is the slide from Israel, and the one you can't see over here. But Canada's almost exactly the same. Our Human Capital Index is really similar, which means we could come to the same situation that we could end up in the same place very easily. So I think maybe one of the things I have to say today is, you can have midwifery like we have in Canada. I think it might be useful.
It's fascinating.
We also, I think, we also have this history, I think, of patriarchy. Israel doesn't have the history of colonialism, but that is something that is very integral to the Canadian tradition, unfortunately. And we also have, in Canada, we have these waves of immigration that occurred, starting in the 1600s. But my mother was Ukrainian, and so I'm really of Ukrainian descent. My dad was of Welsh, British descent. And so we've had Slovak descent, lots of Europeans, then we have Asians. We have a very mixed cultural situation, but we had no history of midwives.
Well, Israel also is very much a melting pot of immigrants from all different places. There are some indigenous that are here for generations, but for sure there's a lot of immigrant population, and has brought, also their influence to midwifery here. But how did Canada how did the modern midwifery in Canada happen?
Well, people often think that we had midwifery. When Canada was being settled, we had indigenous midwifery, but we had no other midwifery. We had people that were coming over, these different immigrants would come over, but this male medical profession was starting to take over. And what happened was, we had I won't go to that slide yet. We ended up having a real hodgepodge of people. The midwives that were coming over with the settlers didn't speak English, and so they were not very politically ready to do anything, and not politically astute enough to try to get what they wanted established. Mm-hmm. And just so you understand a little bit about the context here, these are two pictures. This is a picture of my two nieces. And I really like this picture because I think it really shows Canadian core values, because Canadians typically are considered to be very polite. We're always suggest that we are a different group than the Americans. We're not brash and bold. We do as we're told. And there's actually a joke in Canada. How do you get 50 people out of a pool? And the answer is, say everybody out of the pool, and everybody will go. So when COVID hit, we just ended up, everybody said, oh, we have to put on masks. Okay, sure. Oh, we have to do, that's who we are. It's a very different grouping from Americans. We always have to distinguish ourselves from Americans. The other good stuff about Canada, because let me get on a bit of a podium here, is we've got democracy, we have freedom, we have peace, and we have law and order. That's what we pride ourselves on.
You're talking to a former American, you know that.
Yeah.
And Israelis.
Yeah. And so the other thing is, so we encourage refugees to come. And one of the interesting analogies between Canada and the States is that the States always emphasizes that they're a melting pot, and so they try to make everyone American, and everybody has to pledge to the flag in the morning. Canada has pretty well almost always talked about the fact that we have, we like to think of ourselves as having what they call a vertical mosaic, where we try not to assimilate people. And so like my mother, my grandmother never spoke English, never. She came to Canada, she lived here, she grew up, have a whole sordid history, but she had 7 children and homesteading. She never learned English because she was out in the middle of her Ukrainian settlement out, in Manitoba.
Wow.
But the other thing we have a real core value is in our healthcare, we have universal healthcare. Another thing that very much distinguishes us from the Americans, because we've always believed that we have a socialist government, and we're quite proud of it. And we have a belief in bureaucratic structures and belief in social justice. But here's this downside. We have this very deep, shady history. We have this deep history of residential schools. I don't know if people in Israel know about this, but here is an example of what happened in 1867, actually. The Fathers of Confederation, our first prime minister, declared that they would move all Indigenous people to these residential schools. And you notice down here, these are the teepees of the families whose children had been robbed from them, and they came and they started settling outside of these schools. That's one of the reasons why they changed. And the reason I bring this up, or why they used to be nomadic. So this was a real change for an Indigenous group, is to have to be settled in one place. And they did it so they could be close to their kids. But you can understand when you've got a history of being taken out of your settlement for school, then being taken out of your settlement, especially from up north among the Inuit, to have the privilege, quote unquote, of a birth in the South, was not met with great enthusiasm by the Indigenous people, by Inuit. And they felt that they were being railroaded off their land. And for Inuit, it's very important to be born on the land. So for them to have to be born in Montreal was a real hardship, and they felt it was a plot of the government to remove their land claims. So you understand how this birth process in Canada was really critical. And here's another one of those pictures of the nuns. And it was not just the priests, but the nuns who actually sexually abused the kids. And all of these stories did not come out until just in the last decade or so. So now, I'm sorry, I just had a little bit of diversion there about what Canada is. So you asked, okay, the modern system of Canadian midwifery. Well, this was us in the 70s, right? We came out of the counterculture movement. We came out of various groups. This is me right here. No, I'm only kidding. That's not actually my butt. But I definitely, I mean, I lived on Pier 42 in San Francisco Bay for a bit when I was hitchhiking down to Guatemala. We were hippies. That's what we did. We came out of that counterculture movement. And so, but you see, because I learned from these traditional midwives here, when I came back up to Canada, I started realizing we have no midwifery care. We need to get something together here. And I was already trained. So I just started doing births. And part of it for me also, I was very involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I just felt, well, I don't like man's law, I like God's law, and God's law says you should just have babies where you want. And I trust God more than I trust man and human beings and law. Even though I was a Canadian, and there was no law for us. So we weren't really legal, we were illegal. So I just started practicing. I didn't know that you can't do that, right? Because nobody ever told me you couldn't, and nobody else was providing home births. I was actually the first person to do home births in Ottawa without a physician present. There had been some physicians who were starting to do this as well.
Wow.
But this is who else we were influenced by, of course. Here we go.
Trained with the Indigenous midwives? Oh, here would you
Pardon?
go. You trained with the Indigenous midwives, Betty Ann?
I trained with the ones in Guatemala. When I first came up, I think I've got a picture here. Yeah, when I first came back home, I was actually invited by the Inuit Women's Association, Paktutit, to come to some of the meetings of the elders up north, because they had heard that I had been trained by traditional midwives in Guatemala, and they trusted me more. They didn't think of me as being the medical profession that was trying to rob them of their cultural way of doing birth. So I went up to work with them, and they also they found out that I was actually considering trying to get legislation for midwives. I didn't want to do that at first, but the Toronto midwives pulled me in to do that. And they thought it was the renaissance of reason that white Canadians down south were actually starting to think about midwives. Like, it was so unheard of in Canada, and it was only the Indigenous people who were really doing it. And they were just tickled that we were going to do it. So I actually wrote an article, I wrote a chapter for one of Robbie's books called Childbirth and Authoritative Knowledge. And it was called Heeding Warnings from the Canary, the Whale, and the Inuit. And it was a whole analytical exploration into how people make decisions and why they make decisions, and how, the elders up north, they thought it was ridiculous that medicine should think that they own birth, when they really felt they own birth, and it was a cultural event. So I started to take on, for sure, the ideas of the Inuit. Absolutely. And
so tell me, when you did the legislation for Canadian midwives, what did it include?
Included a lot of Indigenous ideas, but it also included a lot of feminist ideas, because we had also been starting to look, all of these UN conferences on women's issues were happening. I do a whole history about this in the Birthing Models on the Human Rights Frontier book. And so we had we had these the Mexican conference, the conference in Nairobi was a really important one in 1975. 85, the Mexican was 75. There was the Cairo Convention, the Beijing Conference. This is Betty Friedan down here, who had written Feminine Mystique. We were all, I was at university studying feminism. And so part of that had to be incorporated into what we were doing. And here's the body politics that we talked about. And I'm sure that it was going on in Israel at the same time. We were going beyond essentialism, like that we were our biological imperative, right? We felt that our body is a site of both normalization and resistance, and site of social experience and political resistance. And we always thought in terms of how either you can consider your body to be a source of oppression or a source of power. And so we decided it was going to be a source of power. That was our mantra. But here's the other piece. I also started really becoming involved with looking at evidence. And part of that was, I will confess, I actually left a husband who was a pastor of a church. I left him and a few years later discovered this amazing epidemiologist. And so I ended up becoming very scientifically based and oriented. And it was a real turning point for me. And I think that really evidence epidemiology is one of the most important allies for midwives. And it's something that Canadians harnessed much more quickly than the American midwives did. And so it was very important to us, basically. So here is the legislation, what we were looking at this point. We had this history of colonialism, and we were starting to question it much more in the 70s and 80s. We had the counterculture movement, we had the feminist movement, and we had the whole revolution in epidemiology. So that is how our legislation started.
Wow.
And I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I want to talk to you a little bit. We were going to talk a little bit about social movement theory and about the dreams that I had when I first started. And
could you just tell us before you go into that about what it's like to be a midwife there? Because from what I understand, and you could tell us, but the fascinating part is about that midwives have to have hospital privileges as well as home birth privileges. And I think that that is amazing and something that possibly we should aspire to.
Yeah, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to quickly go ahead to this thing here just before, I won't go into this thing here. I'm just going to talk to you about, okay, how we did it in Canada. So one of the things we did in Canada, oops, gone too far. One of the things we did in Canada was, and this was a great advantage for us, is because we did not have any legislation, unlike the United States had certified nurse midwives in the 1950s, we didn't have any midwifery. We had Indigenous midwifery, we had lay midwifery, we had counterculture movement midwifery. So because we really do believe in our bureaucratic structures, which is what I mentioned earlier, we had the advantage of not having an established kind of midwifery that we had to live with. What we decided to do was we decided to go shopping around. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to go shopping around. So one of the things I did was I actually decided to study the theory of professions and how they develop. And there's all these theories. There's a theory about how there's professions are developed from traits because they have traits, like they're at the university level education. They end up getting they get established through their societal norm of being a really important part of the society. There's a theory about, it's called the Neil Weber theory, Max Weber's theory, which is that, professions just usurp territory from one profession and they create an exclusionary club, and they stake out they monopolize a certain jurisdiction, they stake that out, and they keep other people from coming in. And then there's the Marxist theory, which is that professions are basically from the dominant class. And then there's the fourth theory, which is that there are gender-based professions like midwives and nursing, and then other ones are in different genders. And I looked at all that and I thought, I am not really interested in forming a profession that's trying to usurp other people's territory and trying to be exclusive, because we came from a social movement of women wanting to help other women at their births. And I thought, where am I going to find the proper literature to figure out what I want to do? And I found it in the social movement theory, because there I found these four theories. And one of them was the classical strain theory, which is that there's some strain in society, and then you have to go and help, you have to run to kind of help that strain and repair it. So for the civil rights movement, it was African-American people are not getting their fair share. They should be treated like human beings just because of the color of their skin. They should not be segregated. And so that was a huge movement, as you know, in the States. And because I was working with the Black women in Alabama in the late 70s, it was not that long after that movement. The feminist movement was one where we were trying to have women have their equal share. And so I started realizing that that's a really important thing for us to do. But the classical strain theory is that there's a strain in society. The resource mobilization theory is another theory which says you can have all kinds of strain in society, but if you don't have money or you don't have resources put into them, you're not going to get anywhere. And so you have to mobilize people. The third theory is that it's called political process theory, which is that, yeah, well, you can have all kinds of people put money into it and it might work, but you have to have your institution, you have to have your movement institutionalized. Mm-hmm. To become institutionalized as midwives, we thought, okay, we need to get ourselves legislated, and because we weren't. And so this is where this process becomes really important for us. We made a decision that we were going to legislate ourselves. And for Canadians, that's just like, okay, well, we just go to our legislatures and we fight and we will do it. And within 10 years, we had legislation because we lobbied our bureaucratic structures and said, we want this. And they said, okay. And we had, we certainly had resistance from the physicians, but it just happened. But the thing that I was going to say about the fact that we did it in a very strategic manner was we went to Denmark, we went to Holland, we went to Britain, and we went to the United States. We were trying to find a group that we could emulate. We chose very directly not to emulate the States. We felt that it was terribly disorganized there, and not disorganized, I'm so sorry, polarized. We had certified nurse midwives doing like fewer than 1 or 2% births in the home. We had midwives like myself growing from the grassroots up, learning how to do births at home. And they were always fighting among each other. So we made a decision in Canada to have what we call direct entry midwifery. And we were just going to have midwives. So when you ask how we did that, and what our philosophy was, we decided, well, first of all, we want to have all pregnancies covered by insurance. And that's, again, something different from the US, is we want to have that covered. I think you do that in Israel as well. It doesn't matter where you have the baby.
No, home birth is not covered in Israel.
It's covered here. Absolutely, it's covered here. We also decided to have autonomous midwives, meaning primary caregivers. We are not nurses, we are not physicians, we are not under their college, we are under our own college. And we fit into the healthcare system in a symbiotic relationship with the physicians. If we need a consult, we go to them. But women often come and see a midwife at the beginning of their pregnancy and they never meet a physician and never need one. Even if we go into hospital, we go in usually just to get an epidural if they want one.
So each midwife has her own caseload of patients and she can deliver them either at home or in the hospital?
That's right. That each one has their own caseload. And these are our 3 pillars of philosophy of care. Number 1 at the top, you notice the mother has the final say. And so our college is based on the ideals of offering informed choice, offering continuity of care, because what we looked at that time when we were going to legislation was we were looking at the fragmentation of care that was happening in the mainstream system, where women had to they'd go to a general practitioner like a family doc who'd have obstetric privileges. They'd see him till maybe 4 or 5 months. Then they would go to an obstetrician that he sent them to, but that obstetrician was only on call once every 2 weeks. Then they would if they go to the hospital, then they would have nurses they hadn't met in the doctor's office. And then they would go to a whole other group after in postpartum. So we thought, well, what are we doing differently that the women are really liking here? Well, first of all, we see them prenatally. At the first, we weren't, before legislation, we didn't have the right to order lab work and ultrasounds. But as soon as we got legislation, we went, well, why don't we have the right to do our own blood work, our own ultrasounds, do that. Then when the women enter into labor, I go to their house, whether they're having a home or a hospital or a birth center birth, I go to their house to check them out to see if they're really in labor. So they usually labor a certain amount of time at home before they go to hospital if they've chosen hospital. And half the time they decide just to stay home, especially in the middle of winter or January in Canada when it's cold outside. So they just stay put, and we are obligated to follow them wherever they go. you know, like whatever choice they have, we do that. And so the choice of birthplace is a really important piece of our legislation as well. And here's the other piece that I know that those of us that gathered a few days ago to talk about is this: all Canadian midwives are required to attend both home and hospital births. And that is because our legislation grew out of the movements. They grew out of the social movements of the 70s. And so it grew out of feminism. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Because that's what women want. Because they're making the choice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have to prove we have to do at least 5 home births and 5 hospital births a year. I mean, some people are more based in hospital. Some people try to be more based at home or in the birth center. But it really, it's a really important piece for us that we are offering women choice. And the other thing is we're all working independently from the physicians as primary caregivers, because we are what we call in Canada the most responsible person. And in a situation like the breaches that I'm doing, I won the right to do breaches in hospital. And what I'm called is the most responsible person. If the doctor wants to come in and learn, that's okay, but I'm the most responsible person in that room. And that's really key.
That's truly amazing, Betty Ann.
Yeah, well, it's important. The other thing that you'll like this one. So I worked on a policy with the Canadian Association of Midwives, a statement on home birth. So we now in our statement recommend home birth for all low-risk women. That's just what we say. That's the recommendation. They don't all necessarily take it, and not all midwives necessarily are as good advocates as they should be. But we made a decision to make the statement from the Canadians, because what we've recognized from the data that we have collected is that we have, it really protects normal birth. Home birth protects normal birth in any society. And so how do you like this thing I have at the bottom here? Physicians are now trying to get the right to attend home births. Why? Because they recognize that they don't have jurisdiction over a piece of birth that we now have jurisdiction over. What's fascinating to me, I talked about this in one of the conclusions of one of my books. I think it's the birthing models on the human rights frontier. I've always found it very, very curious, because I'm like one of the elders up north, that doctors are in charge of birth around the world. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. It makes more sense to me that women are in charge of birth, and then they choose whatever caregiver they want. And then whatever caregiver they have that is going to be the group that's going to offer them the closest they can to a normal birth should be the first group in line for them to choose. And then if the physicians are needed, then you go to them. But for physicians to be in charge of birth in any society is highly dangerous, because it means that you're going to end up with a very highly medicalized system of birth. And so that's part of our tradition in Canada is that we made a decision that it's really important to safeguard home birth as our avenue to protection.
Wow. You said you had some dreams that guided you professionally. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to some of these dreams. So what's really interesting is we have this situation, right? I just wanted to show you this again, that this is this classical strain theory, resource mobilization, political process, and the cultural revolution paradigm. Okay, so these are theories in the social movement literature. Okay, this is just in sociology. I got a degree in sociology, and I never got a degree in midwifery.
Don't tell anybody.
I teach at women's studies. I haven't actually taught for a couple of years now. But the reason I went to social movement theory is I felt it's really important to change the paradigm. And that is the fourth theory of social movement theory, is that you need to change your paradigm. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's actually, that theory comes from France, of course, because they're into that type of theory. Comes from Alain Touraine. So for me,
how do you change a paradigm?
How? Yeah, we need to change the paradigm. And one of the things that I recognize, and I actually wrote I guess in this, let's see. In this book here, in Mainstreaming Midwives, this is Robbie and I have lived together for like 35 years. I've always offered chapter for her book. So she ended up actually basing this particular book on the article that I wrote on the chapter called From Calling to Career. And because in it, I talk about these theories of professions and the theories of the social movements. And what I recognized as I was doing that is I thought, okay, as midwives in the early 70s, a lot of us were into a bit of what we call la la land. Like we were thinking about, okay, like I love this thing, this is perfect. Like a wildflower, as she spent her days allowing herself to grow. Not many knew of her struggle, but eventually all knew of her light. And I have to say, like, I really felt that this was a spiritual thing. I still think of it as a spiritual thing, but I thought of birth as a spiritual thing. That's why I was so in La La Land that when I came back to Canada, I wasn't thinking about legislation. I thought it would taint midwifery. I thought it would taint what we would do. You also need to know that when Ken and I did that, the study we did, it was largely on American as well as Canadian midwives. We got published in the British Medical Journal.
Your home birth study, right?
The home birth study. It was really, really hard to get people to get the midwives to collect data, because they felt that birth is magical. Why do you want to taint it with statistics, right? like this is real. This is especially California. And so Ken and I ended up going to the Midwives Alliance of Northern America meetings, and we'd have to put on skits to kind of make it fun and make it funny and cajole them into collecting this data. Mm-hmm. So part of that is that midwives, I think, who are thinking about the spirituality of birth and birth and midwifery as a calling, end up being, I notice I spelled primarily wrong there, but they end up being here, like Ina May has been, and like I was at the very beginning of this, search into my midwifery career. And this lovely traditional midwife up here in the left corner, she was part of an exchange we were doing with the Guatemalan midwives. She actually, this is in Ottawa, she actually came into my women's studies department and gave a talk. Mm-hmm. And she did this wonderful talk about how she had become a midwife because she was very sick, and she didn't know what was wrong with her, and she kept thinking, oh, I think I have to go and do somebody's birth. I think I have to become a midwife. And she noticed that as she became a midwife, her headaches went away, and various things that she did went away, and she realized that it must be a calling. And traditional midwives in many countries that I've worked in, and many countries that Robbie has also done research in, have this sense of a calling. And this one wonderful woman down here, she was one of the African-American midwives, Margaret Smith. And she was also very much serving her community. And I feel really, I think that the traditional midwifery that we have is something we need to really preserve. I think that Israel could use a few of those. So this is the other way that people go into our career, right? They go into it as a career, not as a calling. They go into it, they search for the best school. They go to Harvard, they go to McMaster, and that's in Canada. They go to York, they go to all these schools because they want to become a really important, and if they want to use the science, they want to be well respected. And one of the things I say, and this is a dusty road where I dreamed up some of these theories in Afghanistan, I just feel like sometimes when people go into midwifery because it's an aspiring career, or because they have aspirations about a spiritual calling, I think that they end up going through a long, dusty road and they're not really happy. And one of the things that I found when I studied social movement theory is I recognized, the reason I think that I find myself there is because as a midwife, I straddle two spheres. I straddle the career and I straddle, what else? I straddle the career of a social activist. Because one of the things we do as midwives is we have to try to help women get what they need and what they want. And we are constantly struggling with how we're going to work the system so that they can get what they want. So that is why when we went to legislation, we said, we're going to work to get these midwives these women what they want. And we have to keep coming back to those pillars that we have created called informed choice, informed continuity of care, making sure you're invested in women by knowing them all through their pregnancy and their birth and afterwards. That's the rationale behind continuity, is investment in that individual woman. So here is my synopsis, is that women who are, a lot of the midwives are very, they just don't, if they're only going into midwifery because it's a calling, then they become really disillusioned when women don't really want to follow the women are just trying to have a birth. They're not really interested in following their transformative lifestyle that they're trying to get them to follow and change everything they're doing. I mean, I certainly try to do that too. I help women with their nutrition and whatnot, but they're not always in that space. And I've actually had apprentices when I was early in my career who left because they didn't feel like that the women were living up to their spiritual aspirations, which is crazy, but it's real. So here to me is what makes me happy, and what makes, I think, a lot of the midwives in Canada happy, is understanding this engagement in social activism. And it's certainly a calling and a professional mission, but you have to stand up and be counted. And for me, as Canadians, we have to believe that we can change government policies. We have to believe that we can change what we are doing in our whatever jurisdiction we are in. What if it's I think your whole country is based on a very similar system. In Canada, each province has its own system. Certainly we exchange ideas and that's why across the country, we all made a decision that we were going to require home birth as part of our continuing profession. Mm-hmm. But here I think is the other piece that's really, really important. And I got this term, never whisper in the presence of wrong, from the anti-nuclear movement when we were working against nuclear bombs, like it was the 70s, 80s, when that was really, really an important piece. We were trying to figure out why our men were building more bombs instead of doing something that was going to create more peace. And so I think that we have really used this in our midwifery. Again, it's one of those mantras we need to keep coming back to. If a physician has walked in and they're going to do something that you know very well this woman doesn't want, you have to be there to defend her. You have to do what you want to do. And the best way for us to be able to defend women was to not have the doctors involved at all unless we needed them. So that's the status. And I walk into a hospital if the mother wants one, but we don't use the docs at all unless we've got major decelerations and late decels, or we have the need for something different other than an epidural. Because if they just want an epidural, we just phone the anesthesiologist, he comes and places it, and then we manage it, right? So that's the crux of what we do in our country.
And so that's where data comes in. Can you explain that? Your study, your huge study on home births, and then being involved in the breach trial in Frankfurt, all this information?
Yeah. Okay. So happened for me, the reason I discovered Frankfurt is, can I get a timing on this? How much time have we got?
We have about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay. One of the things that I found, and it's a really profound thing that I think people don't quite get, is that, I mean, we talked about my dreams, we're jumping around it, but one of my biggest dreams when I first came back to Canada, and it was, I thought, we need to get a good home birth study out. And so that was one of my, well, first of all, I wanted to bring back normal births. So I think we managed that. Then we wanted to get it entrenched in science. And that's why I harnessed my husband. He still says I had to do this because Betty Ann wasn't going to let me get away without it. You know, so we got that study together. It was really important because you know, it's been downloaded over 250,000 times, and it was one of the first home birth studies that was up. First of all, it was large enough. It was prospective. It was there was a validation study on it. And it was the first time that ACOG, after we'd put out a study, mentioned research in their statements against home births. So I'm now talking not about Canada, about the States, because of course Canada is influenced by the States. But the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology had, from the 1970s on, just statements against home birth, just saying, oh, it's dangerous, we shouldn't be doing it. And then what happened was, after our study came out, 2006 was the very first year that ACOG actually mentioned data, because they had just done it based on the old boys club. And they thought that people would listen to them. And so that's why I keep saying epidemiology is our key, and it's something that's really critical. Is it going to change minds? It changes minds, not necessarily of OBs, it changes minds of the ministries of health, because they listen to data, and public health listen to data. In the States, the way we got things, the first medical organization that actually even paid any credence to home birth was the American Public Health Association in 2001. And again, it was based on our study. Here we have two Canadians doing a study in the States, because in the States, they hadn't, the midwives had not quite, the certified nurse midwives had put out a pretty good study. Patricia Murphy-Aiken and Judith Rooks as well done the birth center study, but they hadn't done a really large study. So this study was on 5,418 births. So that was a real key to us, that we recognized that was really important. So once we got legislation for midwives, and we had home birth entrenched in Canada, that's when I started looking into the breech issue, because it was happening around the year 2000, when the term breech trial had suddenly, I'm going to stop showing my screen because I think I'm going to go to something else. I wasn't actually going to do this today, but I think we've got time. I started realizing that we had a problem. Let me see here. No, I'm not going to be able to go to it. Sorry. I'll just sit on evidence. That's a good one.
And then I still want to touch on human rights for mothers and babies, human rights issues.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing you want me to talk about. That's right. Okay.
Thanks.
Let me just see. I'm having a hard time getting back to my Zoom. Oh, here we go. There we go. Stop sharing screen. Oh, where to stop? Good. Sorry. So breech to me is the microcosm of everything else that's gone wrong with obstetrics. Because we had this term breech trial that was done in Canada, right? It was done in Toronto, which is 4.5 hours from here. And everybody in Canada took part in this study. And it was a randomized control trial that was to be, you know, the trial that was going to end any doubt about breech. And I now call it the Titanic of research, because it was the ship that was never going to sink, right? And this is the first time when a randomized control trial showed its ugly face. And, you know, I talked to Sue Downs about this in Britain. I said, oh my goodness, finally, they figured out that maybe randomized control trials are not the best type of research to use for obstetrics. Why? Because a randomized control trial is something where you have to have the true gold standard of randomized control trial is that you have a double-blinded study. The person giving you the treatment and the person getting the treatment don't know what's going on. Right?
It doesn't really take women's choices into account, does it?
Yeah, it's great for drug trials. It's great because you're getting an envelope and the doc's giving it to you. Doesn't, you know, they don't know what they're giving you, and the person who's receiving it, they're just taking this drug. They don't know if it's a placebo. But in obstetrics, almost everything, you know what they're doing. I mean, with the vaginal, you know, the term breech trial, you knew if you were getting a section or not. And so for me, Ken and I have always, Ken's my husband, epidemiologist, he and I went to Oxford in 1991 together. We took our 4 kids, we put them in school. It was great. It was crazy. And we hung out with Ian Chalmers, who was headed up the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit. I was studying about Indigenous people. I was going to Rhode and the Bodleian Library. It was quite an amazing time. And at that point, we said to Ian, why are you studying, why are you only looking at randomized control trials? Like, because we thought we can't do a randomized control trial on home birth. You're not going to convince anyone. And that was later proven by that Dutch researcher who showed even in Holland, you can't do it. And so it was the beginning for us, for Ken and I, about going on a rampage about, excuse me, going on a, let's see, on an educational expedition to make sure that people understood that in obstetrics, it's really better to do observational data. So for the term breech trial, the reason that it ended up being such a sham is a lot of people that, like in Europe, people in Europe did not join into it. Now, Mark Glazerman in Your Fine Country made a decision. He was going to follow it and he was going to convince everybody across Israel to engage in it. And then when 2 years later, they realized that those babies that they—
Can you tell us about the term breech trial? I don't know that everybody knows about it.
Well, the term breech trial, it was in 121 countries, sorry, it was in 26 countries in 121 settings. Mm-hmm. And that term breech trial ended up, at first it looked like the, it was very dangerous to have a vaginal breech birth. It looked like it was better to do a cesarean. And then 2 years later, but what they were using was they were using short-term endpoints. They were looking, because anytime you do a randomized control trial, it's really hard to get enough baby deaths, even with breeches. They don't die very frequently, thank God. But what happened was they were looking at short-term endpoints like APGARs and tonicity and things that go away after a few minutes, right? And brachial plexus. So when they realized 2 years later that these babies that they thought were in terrible condition were no longer in terrible condition, in fact, everything had disappeared, most of it had disappeared with the APGARs, they recognized they'd made a mistake. So Mark, to his credit, your Mark in Bedlinson Hospital in Tel Aviv, said to Mary Hannah, you should rescind this article. Well, she didn't do it. And I was totally embarrassed. And we were like, all the Canadians were going, oh my goodness, she's not rescinding this trial. So to his credit, again, Mark wrote this article called 5 Years to the Term Breech Trial, The Rise and Fall of a Randomized Control Trial. And I said, this is the guy we need. So I brought Mark to Canada, and I brought the Frankfurt team that I'd gone to visit when I discovered that Frank Leuven was doing births the way I learned from traditional midwives in the upright position. I said to Frank, if I can work on your data, because I need it, because none of the traditional midwives don't have enough births going on. I can learn from them, but they can only explain to me why they're, the traditional midwives taught me, okay, well, when you've got a birth that's going okay, you throw a rope over a beam and you dangle, but when you have shoulder dystocia or you have a breech, you fall over on your hands and knees. Now, how did they know that? Because they'd watched it for centuries. They got it from their mothers, and they knew what to do. So when I found out about Frank doing this birth in the upright position in Frankfurt, I went to him and he showed me these videos, and I said, I could have kissed him. I said, you're doing births the way I learned from traditional midwives. Why isn't anyone else doing that? He said, well, because we never thought of it, right? And I have a whole, I do hours about this, about how it started with these guys that just didn't realize you could get up.
So based on all that, you got privileges in Ottawa to do.
Yeah. So because I had done all this work in Frankfurt, and because we had a huge conference here, we had a breech conference. I brought Mark from Bedlinson, and I love to tell the story that Mark came and said, ooh, I feel, because it was organized this, the women that were having unnecessary sections. And Mark came to me and said, I feel like I'm in a social movement. And here's this man from Bellinson Hospital with 9,000 births a year. He's in a suit and tie. He speaks Russian, Hebrew, English, German. And I said, Mark, you are in a social movement. And he totally enjoyed it. And then he came back to our Washington conference as well. So then he asked me to come to Israel. So I ended up going to Tel Aviv. So I went with the Frankfurt team to teach Mark how to do this. But what's interesting is then he wrote me later saying, I can't get people to change, Betty Ann. I said, well, Mark, that's because you spent so many years trying to get them involved in the randomized control trial, and now you're trying to change them back. And it's much harder to change people to go back to doing less intervention than to convince them to do more intervention because of the liability. So you're going to need the midwives. You should get the midwives in tow, and you should get the women like we did here in Canada and change it. The midwives are doing 90% of the breaches now at our hospital in Ottawa.
Yay.
And the doctors are still saying it should be done by section. I'm going, well, you want to just check it out over here in our room? I mean, we invite them in, but what we're finding is it's really hard because they often want to come in to criticize rather than learn. And so we're kind of safeguarded about it because we've got to protect it again. Like we're on constant vigilance. So do we want to go back to the human rights thing? I'm sorry.
Yes, please. We only have a few minutes left.
Okay, so I just wanted to tell you that my philosophy also is very unlike the neoliberal philosophy. You know, the neoliberal philosophy is that it basically defines human progress in terms of economics and in terms of whether the large corporations are making enough money, and they feel, if you've got large corporations in your country that are making enough money, you're doing well, as opposed to looking at the weakest of the weak and whether they're doing well. And so I define progress in terms of human rights. And that's exactly what that book was, the Birthing on the Human Rights Frontier, is it's talking about the need for us as midwives to speak truth to power. And so in terms of human rights, it's amazing now how many countries, just since 2005, have created human rights tribunals. And we have, I think I have something here. We've had a few, so we have had our very first case in 2009. We got our maternal mortality resolution passed through at the UN, right? Which was that preventing maternal mortality and morbidity, it's not just mortality, morbidity, and often from intervention, is a human right. That's spectacular, but it took us till 2009 because before we were just involved in all these disenfranchised social movements. Am I talking too quickly, Mindy? Okay, I will slow down. I was just thinking about that. Okay, so we moved from that to, then we had 2007, we had our Human Rights Declaration on Indigenous rights, and that's been very useful for our Indigenous group here. Then in 2011, we had our first case in Brazil, where a mother who had lost her daughter in childbirth sued the Brazilian government for the human right to dignity. She was a Black woman, and she felt that her daughter had not been taken care of. And she won, and she won because she took it to CEDAW, she took it to the UN, and used their human rights system. And it was one of the first cases where people, when they are not getting what they want legally on the ground from their own government, can go internationally to use the international UN rights declarations. And I think Israel should think about that. And of course, one of the most important cases in Europe was the Anna Trusky case, when Agnes Gereb, who's quite a good friend of ours, and we spent quite some time before she was in jail, but when she ended up being in jail and under house arrest, Anna could not get her birth. So you know the case of Anna taking her case to the European Human Rights Commission, winning her case, and then getting the right in Hungary for there to be midwifery, because and it's so fascinating to me because it keeps going back to this thing about normal birth and normalcy. The to me, we were always thinking in the 70s and 80s and 90s still about proving the safety of home birth. But Anna had a totally different avenue with her lawyers, because she was harnessing this entire case on the right to privacy. And the European court ruled that they had never thought about the fact that in the Middle Ages, you didn't need laws for privacy in childbirth because you just had them. But now when everything is regulated up the yin yang to everything, on everything, you have to actually provide laws that will put in place something that can protect women's privacy during childbirth. So they made a decision to, well, she won her case against the Hungarian government. So that was a really important case. So I think that it's time for us to do that with the breech issue. I'm considering some things here. I can't get into them yet, but I feel like, yeah, we've moved from, I mean, it's my philosophy has always been about saving normal birth. So I originally wanted to do something about home birth. We did that. We got things legislated here. We got our huge study out. It's been well downloaded. We've got several other studies out since in Canada. The Netherlands is the great one. And so now I'm moving into breech and bringing back breech. And one of my best, I'll just finish one thing before, I think there will be other people wanting questions, but I just want to tell you that my biggest, one of my biggest dreams has been to go back to Guatemala and to teach the physicians how to do upright breech birth, and then say to them, you know where I learned this from? I learned it from the traditional midwives, las viejitas en el campo allá en la calle, and you know, the little old ladies down the road from you is where I learned how to do this. And it's about time you guys started thinking about how and why traditional midwives are very important in your country. Mm-hmm. They're doing a lot of the births there. And they're actually now, they're going to legislation. They actually got a bill passed through Congress that they'd actually get paid. Wow. The president vetoed it. Yeah. So yeah, I think that moving into the millennium has our aim to look at human rights, and human rights tribunals is a really important one. And we've just won the gender equity case. I don't know if any of you know of it in Canada. Gender equity pay. We took our Ministry of Health to the Human Rights Tribunal based on the fact that we were not getting paid and our salaries were not going up with the physicians, and we won our case.
Amazing. That's amazing. So how can midwives help save the planet? I mean, you are amazing using your social activism, now using the platform of human rights. And can we take it one step further to save the planet?
I think just by taking back normal birth, that's the most important thing. That's the basis of this whole talk is you gotta use whatever you can. I mean, whether it's a social movement, you have to get with the women though too. You have to have the women working. I mean, it's my mantra with Mark Glazerman. You have to get the midwives and the mothers working together because normal birth is a human right. I actually think we need a declaration at the UN on saving normal birth. We've got them, on the right to have maternal, prevention of maternal mortality, but we also have the right to have normal birth. There are declarations now about obstetric violence that's been brought on by the Argentinians especially, and from the Latin Americans. But that's the real key to, I think, to saving the planet, is to save normal birth. That's our duty as midwives.
Amen.
And if you're not doing it, you need to move over. You need to get some traditional midwives going in your country.
We'll have to import some.
And you can do it in the hospital, but you need to be thinking about more home birth, I think, to get balanced. Or freestanding birth centers. I hear you're having some trouble with that one.
Yes, we need to talk about that. It's 8:15, and I'd like to open the mic to questions from the crowd. Does anybody have any questions? If not, I still would like to hear about your experience in Afghanistan. Can we do that for a few minutes?
Sure. Experience in Afghanistan. Okay, so Afghanistan, I originally went to Afghanistan in 1990, actually. I went there because it's an interesting way I got there. This is before the Taliban. This is quite a while ago. I was 10. No, 1990 was quite a while ago. I went because I was working with the Midwives Alliance of North America, and Kate Davidson, one of my colleagues on the board, had been on a plane with somebody who was lamenting the fact that he was working in Afghanistan and they just couldn't get the doctors to come there and they really needed them. And she says, well, have you ever thought of using midwives? And the guy said, oh, do you think you could get some? And she said, sure, I know just the person. Because I had just come back from Nicaragua, and we had done this Nicaragua in Latin America, and we had done something with the traditional midwives there during the Ortega. It was the revolution going on there in 1987. And so I went with this woman to Afghanistan, and it was quite scary because we didn't know that we were going to be going to a place where it was all warlord territory, where there was no law. And as Kate said at one point, we were saying, I said to her, we were working in the Afghan refugee hospital, but also out in the refugee camps. And when we talked to the woman who was running it, I couldn't even get a visa originally to go because it was too dangerous. So we ended up going by getting a visa from the Canadian embassy. When I went to visit, we were in Cambodia because we were just thinking we were just going to stay around there. And then I got a visa to get in. And what I said to Kim when we were there, I said, it's scary. I said, what I realized is it's kind of like you're okay now because you think you're okay, but it's just because they haven't got you yet. And it was I realized that they had a bounty out for our on our heads because we were white American women. So that was quite difficult. And then I went back in 2003 or 4 with the Médecins du Monde to set up a place not on the border of, that last time I was in the Afghan refugee camps in Peshawar. This time I went to Nimroz province, which was very far from Kabul. And it was after that I met Mindy, because we went back to do the presentation in France at the Midwifery Today convention. But it was lovely to work with the traditional midwives, and I was one of the people who could get out in the, to really see how people are living and what they're doing. I have 37
we have some questions coming up. Betty Ann?
Betty Ann?
Yes. Debbie Goodell-Beer?
Yes, hi. Betty Ann, hi. Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. And believe me, I think you could carry on for another hour or two and we all would be glued to our screens. But I do have a question about another pandemic which we're facing here, which is the induction of labor, which I think is even hurting normal childbirth even more than the breech issue, which is, relatively less in terms of its occurrence. And here in Israel, and also after the article that was published about the, I think it was in the New England, about that there's no increase in cesarean section if you induce primiparas or nulliparas at 39 weeks. So although they're not doing that here in Israel because we have such a high birth rate that it would be just filling up all the labor and delivery rooms, but there is still a very, very, very high percentage of births that are started by induction, and that, I don't have to tell you, obviously starts the whole thing off on on the left foot. So what can you help us with that?
Okay, so whenever I look at something like that, and I hear you, so I've lived through about 3 or 4 changes of I've lived through the Bristol and Dublin studies that originally suggested that active management is a better thing to do. We should be augmenting as much as possible, and it helps people to avoid cesareans. And then we went back for another decade, I think, where we said no, it increases cesareans. Whether or not it increases cesareans or more intervention, the question is not that to me. The question always comes back to, do women really want to have this done to them? And often women just capitulate. They go, oh, okay, well, if that's what you think I should do, I guess we should just do that. That's the problem, is you have to have good consumer,
Education.
you have to have consumer groups. I mean, we have, I will send you, you will be very interested in this, actually. I don't know, I'll have to get your email. I'll send it to Mindy and to Dina and Gomer. But you have to have women on the ground questioning it. So I'll give you an example that what just happened is we had McMaster University was talking about doing a study on induction, and they were going to do surveys of people to see if they would like to be induced at 39 weeks, just because it seems to be a better thing to do. And what's very interesting is the consumers got out in droves. These are the women on the ground, and they said that they thought this was a highly questionable survey that was being done, because they felt that they were doing it in order to promote the idea. And they felt that it was a real disservice to women, and they shut them right down. A large group of women, it wasn't even that large. It was one of the people working with me on the breach issue shut down the survey, because she knew that it was going to be a way to help cajole women into thinking that it's okay to do. And so it does come back to this idea of, do we want to have a medicalized system of birth, or do we want to continue to have normal birth? And if we're going to continue to have normal birth, yeah, a study might say, well, it might be better if you do this, but just like the randomized control trial for the breach and this thing in the New England Journal, that's fine. But they're probably going to have another study in another few years that's going to suggest,
Right.
well, if you have this and this, then it's probably going to be okay. I just say you have to have women who are interested in saving normal birth, who really think that having a normal birth is something to be valued. And I always come back to the traditional midwives, because they hold space for normal birth. And I come back to home birth, because home birth and freestanding birth centers hold space for normal birth. Because even midwives that go into hospital end up being much more interventionist.
Yes, thank you.
If they even have primary care providers.
Thank you. Gila had a question. Gila Zarbiv.
Hi. I first want to say thank you so much. You are a role model for me, an inspiration. So motivating and empowering. You can only really be lucky to live in the world that you speak of, that you live in. I have a million questions, but I'll just ask one. I think that you say, go back to home birth. And I don't know where you are of the policy or the issues we face in Israel, but home birth midwives put their houses and their lives and their jobs and their families on the line because they don't have insurance, and they give up everything for this dream for the rest of us. And the infrastructure for the country, let alone the policy, is not set up to support this type of birthing structure. As a midwife who dreams of changing the scope of practice for midwives in Israel, I find myself sometimes at a loss of where to start. Do I start with a policy? Do I start with the bureaucracy? Do I start with the insurance? Where we are so far behind from the world that you're speaking of when you say go back to home birth, even that is so foreign. Where would you suggest a country like us, who midwives are limited to exclusively delivering mainly, unfortunately, in hospitals, where does a country like us start?
I think you have to harness the women, the doulas, and the midwives. They have to come together, have conferences, have kitchen table discussions, think about what you're doing, look at what other people have done. There's plenty of models. Look at all the models. I've written 3 books on models. The model usually is a grassroots one. It's not usually to go straight to policy. It's to talk to women about what they want. And once the women say what they want, they become a powerful force. And I believe that is true in any jurisdiction I have ever worked. The only place possibly where that doesn't work as well is Afghanistan. But what's interesting about that is in Afghanistan, the traditional midwives are the only thing that some women have in the country. And I'm a little nervous about what they're doing. Like the American College of Nurse Midwives has gone in there to try to corral everyone into hospitals. And I'm going, and the Canadians went in, we went in working with the traditional midwives, and we lost our funding after 2 years because we were working with the traditional midwives. So I put in, I've got a whole chapter in one of the books of that on birthing models and human rights frontier. I think you have to work with women. That's my message always. But and you know, when the person who started our Coalition for Breech Birth started the coalition, it was because she had had a section after having a 4-hour labor birth. Her name's Robin Guy. And then there was another, I said, you need to start an organization. And then I started talking to another one. And then the two of them got together and they said, well, the reason we didn't want to start it, Betty Ann, when you first said that, is because we thought we're only 2 people. I said, and you know what? The coalition now has 7,000 people on their Facebook page. They were the ones who helped me, but they organized a conference with me. I believe conferences, and you know what? Israel's one of the few countries now that can actually have a conference because you're not in lockdown the way we are everywhere else. You have to work with women, and you have to, but women don't always know what is available. So the midwives are the ones who have to educate the women and the doulas and build up steam. That's how you have to do it. You have to say, we're not happy with what's here. If you win this court case with the birth centers, I think that's your key, is it'll start, hopefully it'll start, because what I do is every time I see an avenue that I can move in, I go for it, because I go, okay, like when I realized at the Montfort that I had a friendly physician and I had just gone to Frankfurt, I went, okay, I'm just going to ask for privileges. And in Canada, it's true. If you ask, sometimes you can ask nicely and politely and people will do it, but we're fighting the docs here as well. But if it, so what I think is that you, because this court, I would dovetail anything on this new court case. If that court case if you win, then move in and say, okay, we don't just want freestanding birth centers, we also want home birth. If you lose, then you really move in saying, this is improper, women want this. Either one, but you have to do it loudly. You have to go on air, you have to invite people over. Ken and I can come on and talk about home birth. We just did this whole thing with an economist in the States. We just put out a thing called Pivoting to Home Birth in the Time of, Pivoting to Home Birth and Freestanding Birth Centers in the time of COVID-19.
There's another question, excuse me, Betty Ann, there's another question from the head of the home birth midwives, Michal Bonstein. I want to just ask you if you could unmute her so she can join the conversation. Michal?
Unmute. Okay. Hi לכולם, hi Betty. Hello, can you hear me?
No, come a little closer, please.
Barely. I think if I come closer, I'll hear you.
את לא שומעים אותי טוב?
Now we hear you.
Okay. So Betty, you remember we went swimming together in the Tel Aviv beach?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. We heard about the conference for breech birth through rumors, through the doctors. And once we heard about it, the home midwives, immediately we called you up and we asked you to come and talk with our organization, that we arranged it within 3 hours. And you told me, please take me to the beach. I've been closed in this hospital for 4 days or whatever, and I must go to the beach. So we drove to the beach and you jumped in the water. It was pretty cold and rough. And then unfortunately, somebody broke into my car and stole all your passports, computers, and everything. There was no talk with the midwives, and it was a really unfortunate thing. We just went out for dinner after that. So yeah, but still there was an influence for that conference, because 3 days after the conference, I had a home birth, and this lady suddenly had a breech. And I took her to the hospital because I don't know how to deliver a breech. I have no experience and we're not allowed to either. So I got to the hospital and she was like 10 centimeters and they were saying, oh my God, we need to take her to the operating room. And I said, hey, didn't you go to the conference in Bennington Hospital? And they said, oh yeah, we've been there. And I said, okay, so let's do it. She's ready. She's gonna stand on all fours and let's just do this. And they did it. It was amazing, you know? So that was
great.
Yeah. And then you actually took care of a lady of mine that I escaped her from the hospital where they wanted to have an operation, and we smuggled her to your hands and you helped her do turnover of the baby, and then she had a home birth. So that's all that happened when you were here, which was quite exciting.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you for that follow-up.
Yeah, and I want to take this moment, you know, this time where you're sitting here with us like an elder of the tribe of midwifery. And I think from what I know, most midwives, when we talk about our work, we have this really strong, special sparkle in our eyes, and we really, really have a calling. And everyone has a different way, a different place where she does it. But I really want to take, you know, advantage of this moment where you're sitting here with us and ask my friends, midwives, sister midwives, who've been sharing this walk for so many years, to support home birth in Israel a little more, because there's a lot of antagonism, a lot of difficulty along the way. It's hard for us to arrive in the hospital with a woman. We're treated as suspicious, and we don't really get a lot of help from our sisters. That's the truth. And I think now there is a big awakening of the midwives in Israel. And I think it's a good chance to really take this vision of bringing back normal birth. A normal birth is where the woman birth is from within herself, and she doesn't need much but support and, you know, safety from us. So, you know, that's really a call for me to all of my sisters, with you being there, like, you know, our elder, our inspiration. Yeah.
Thank you, Michal. We have to wrap up.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much, Biddy Ann, for your inspiring talk. It's been really fascinating to hear your travels and your way that you got through this, and it's been really inspiring, and I hope that it will affect us and we can put some change in and grow and change, and we can keep being in touch with you. I would really appreciate that.
I also want to say I really appreciate what Michaela just said. I just wanted to say that there's this wonderful little thing I remembered I wanted to talk about at the very end, is that we just found out about this indigenous fable that is happening in BC about, you know, we're having some forest fires in Canada, and the one of these indigenous elders said, well, you know, I met a hummingbird that was coming to help put out the fire, and they said, how is, they talked to the hummingbird, and the hummingbird said, he's a tiny little bird, right? It's actually an insect, but he was carrying water. He said, what are you doing here? Well, I just want to do my part. I just want to do my part. He's got this tiny little bit of water trying to put out the forest fire, but he just feels he can do his part. And I really do think that everybody can do their part. And I think that it's really important, whoever is bringing back normal birth are the people that you need to be following for sure. You do need to talk to those people, and you need to work collaboratively with. And I think that includes the doulas, because they are really concerned about normal birth, and women should just be allowed to do what they want to do. Said it several times. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your inspiring talk. And we'd like to keep in touch.
All right. See ya.
Good night.
Yeah.